Hello again, everyone. So our last speaker tonight is Professor Jim McAdam, formerly of the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Belfast. He'll be discussing agroforestry, trees on farms and carbon-neutral livestock systems. Jim was brought up on a mixed farm in Northern Ireland. During a career in agroforestry research and development, he started the Agroforestry Research Programme in Northern Ireland in 1989. He was the head of the Grassland and Plant Science branch in AFBI until retirement in 2018. He's a past chairman of the Farm Woodland Forum and has participated in a number of national and EU agroforestry-based programmes. His research interests revolve around the potential for silvopasture to help farmers move towards a carbon-neutral livestock industry in a climate-challenged environment. He also has a background and ongoing interest in sustainable management of upland landscapes to sequester carbon and restore biodiversity, and acts as an environmental farming scheme facilitator for Ulster Wildlife in delivering a farmer-based environment support group. Professor McAdam, Jim, thanks ever so much for your patience. If you're ready, I'll pass across to you.
Thank you very much, Will, for that introduction, and thank you, Marisha, for giving me a good lead in there with your indeed. What I want to talk about really tonight is looking at agroforestry as an option whereby we can help move towards more carbon neutral livestock systems. We've had 3 other excellent talks on some of the basic ways we can manage land and some of the more scientific issues that are behind that. But really what I want to do now is look at perhaps a system which can help us on a practical level and introduced on farms, help lead us to a more carbon neutral livestock system. What I want to do is first of all give an overview of the current problems facing livestock agriculture. These have already been fairly well alluded to by previous speakers. Then what do we mean by agroforestry? Because I'm obviously going to try and show you where our research on agroforestry, where that fits in, and what can silvopasture and agroforestry offer. And then how might we deliver that? That's really the challenge at the end of the day. I think I will hopefully show that agroforestry can work as an option in certain scenarios, but the question is how do we get that into farming systems and how do we shift that mindset to get it? And I feel like we've already talked about some of the key issues facing agriculture, and really in Ireland too, and I'll probably nearly all of my research examples will refer to work done in Ireland, in both northern and southern Ireland, because you can see right away that we have our livestock, we are a very good and efficient livestock producing nation, but we have a big problem in that our greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture make such a huge contribution to our overall total, far more than Wales, of course, which has a higher energy sector in that, and the UK as a whole. And of course, most of that greenhouse gas emissions are being generated from livestock production. And the nub of the problem really is that it's not going away. It's really facing us down the line. We have to really have a more serious look at our livestock production and see how we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. Those are the curves for the last 30 years from the south of Ireland, where you can see that agriculture remains the highest greenhouse gas emissions, and that unlike the other key sectors where there are declining proportions of greenhouse gas emissions, agriculture is stubbornly staying there at the top. So that's really one of the key problems we have to face if we're going to ensure that livestock farming can continue on this island. And I would also add that these issues would also affect Wales, Scotland, and England. We also have a huge problem with ammonia. Ammonia is a powerful air pollutant. It's got significant implications for human health and for biodiversity. And once again, like greenhouse gas emissions, it's persistently there at the top and it's not going away. If you look at the data for Northern Ireland there, almost all other pollutant gases we're managing to reduce in the atmosphere, whereas ammonia is sitting up there. And really, over 95% of that ammonia is being generated from livestock, and it's causing the problems which most of you are well associated with. And in many cases, the driver is the effect of ammonia on sensitive habitats, particularly our peatlands and uplands. To come back to something I think that Sarah was talking about, livestock production is important. No matter about the debate, livestock production has a unfairly bad press from some sectors. Yet, if we look at it realistically, 65% of UK farmland is best suited for growing grass for animals to eat. And the only way we can turn that land area into nutritional food is to convert it through animals. So really, we have that strong argument for livestock production. And as I said, livestock production is getting a bad press. We have to really look at the bigger picture in some cases and look at where our meat production from grass. There's a lot of complaint about and we've seen the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock production. They are high, but having processed fruit and vegetables are, if you look at it from a nutrient density point of view, meat production has a lower carbon footprint than actually processed fruit and vegetables. These are the sort of arguments that I think as a livestock farming community, we have to keep putting to the fore. We're not trying to tell anyone what their diet should be, but we're thinking of land utilization and the efficient utilization of our land. Then livestock production is the best we can convert, a way we can use our grasslands to produce nutritious food. But the challenge is, how can we make this livestock production more carbon neutral? Well, there are two key strategies to meet this challenge. First of all, we can increase the dependence on grass or homegrown forage. In other words, imported feed substitution. I don't know the figures for Wales, but in Northern Ireland, for example, only 65% of our beef production is actually coming from grass. The rest is coming from largely imported soya and other feedstuffs from abroad. And that is contributing to a lot of our soil phosphate problems. It's contributing to greenhouse gas problems. So if we had, number one, if we increased our dependence on grass through some of the grazing systems that Sarah has been talking about earlier, and Marisha, then we would have a much more, we would at the same time lower our greenhouse gas emissions and increase the efficiency of our livestock production. But then secondly, the key arm of the strategy that I'm going to talk about is we could absorb more carbon on our farms to reduce our net emissions and enhance biodiversity and water quality at the same time. And the key word is net. Of course, when we look at agriculture figures, we're talking about gross emissions. But if we looked at our agricultural industry from the point of view, what is the net emission profile from farming, then if we looked at more novel ways to absorb more carbon on our farms, we could make our overall emission profile more efficient. So that's really where the stance I'm coming from. Agroforestry is one potential tool in that armory. And it's really just a collective name for land use where trees are combined with crops and or animals. And the key words are on the same unit of land. We could have a field and we could have a Sitka spruce forest on the same farm, but that is not agroforestry because you're not getting the ecological and the economic interactions between those two components to give you the benefits that we've shown that agroforestry can bring. And because in Wales and Ireland, we're largely talking about a pastoral scenario where we're trying to make pastoral agriculture more carbon efficient. Then we're talking about trees growing in grazed pasture in a regular varied passage or silvopasture. Agroforestry is a worldwide practice where their crops are grown with trees and crops are grown together in many different ways. But in our scenario, we're talking about silvopasture. And silvopasture is really an integrated multifunctional land use option, which is delivering a whole range of ecosystem services. If you look at that graph, in the middle there, you have, we have, if you had a simple grazing system, a sheep or a cow on grass, You have a fairly simple system where you have nutrients being returned. If there are too many excess nutrients in the system, they escape into the water and they cause pollution. You have a fairly simple ecosystem, and as we know from our basic science, simpler ecosystems are less stable than more complex ecosystems. Whereas if you stick a tree into that system, you immediately introduce a level of complexity which makes the system more stable and gives you the potential to deliver a whole range of environmental benefits, as well as a lot of other multifunctionality. Just some examples of silvopastoral systems. We have grazing in forests, for example, following thinning and reseeding. That's actually in Wales, where a large forest was respaced quite a few years before. Grass and clover was sown between the trees with light erosion and trampling in the seed, and you established a silvopasture. There are many, many other examples of where livestock are integrated with trees, creating a silvopastoral system. There were sheep, cattle, poultry, pigs. All of those are variants of a system which are giving you multifunctional outputs. In AFBI's research program, which we started in 1989, we were part of a national network of silvopastoral experiments, one site of which was at Northwick, one site of which was at Branasmar. So, you know, we have connections with some of the other speakers, but that network of trials demonstrated that silvopasture could be established successfully on livestock farms. Our early research was with sheep, and I've just shown you a quick sequence of photographs of how, as our part of that national network trial, where we used ash trees. It was an unfortunate site decision now, but at least we've learned the principles from that, and we were able to establish those in sheep grazed pasture and demonstrate a whole range of benefits and outputs from that system. Of course, the trees at that spacing and with livestock continually with them since they were planted in the early years need to be protected against stock grazing, and that can be done. And with proper grazing and rotational grazing management, you can significantly reduce the interaction of the livestock with the trees. And the bottom left picture there really shows, I think, where we were coming from in this. None of us involved in the agroforestry research, certainly in the early years, were foresters. We were all grassland agronomists in some way or other. So our challenge was really to try and sell this system to farmers at the end of the day, and to demonstrate that this is really a grassland management system, and you manage the grass as you would in any other scenario. You top, put on slurry, put on fertilizer, cut silage if you want, and the trees were simply an add-on which could give you additional environmental benefits. And we proved that that could be done, and that it was successful in delivering those things that we were talking about. That's our site not so long ago, where we still have about 65–70% grass production under 28-year-old ash trees they are now, and we've had some thinning of the trees to keep the light levels up, but still achieve the environmental outputs that we wanted from the site. All of this has been done in fully replicated trials, 3 replicates of each site, initially over 6 sites in the UK. So the early principles of silvopasture were well demonstrated and made. What about the performance of the system? Well, we found, much to our surprise, that we expected after about 5 or 6 years, the trees planted at that spacing, which was 5 meters apart, that's 400 trees per hectare. In a normal woodland, you're planting 1,200 or more, a couple of thousand. But we found at that spacing that it was, for 12 years, we were able to get full sheep output from that pasture. So in other words, the basic payment, or single farm payment, was actually unaffected for that, and the department recognized that. Then after about 12 years, the light levels started to affect the pasture, and sheep production started to gradually decline. So we had a decision to make. We could either let the tree crop continue to grow, let the livestock production continue to fall, or we could selectively thin the trees, let more light in, let the pasture pick up, and continue with the sort of multifunctional outputs that we had the system designed for. And in all the meetings we've had with farmers, talking to them about agroforestry, the one thing they have liked is the flexibility of the system. If you're a farmer and someone is trying to persuade you to plant trees, to plant a woodland block or a forestry block, that's that. Once you plant that, that's that land out of your farm system for maybe 40, 50 years or whatever. Whereas if you put that land in agroforestry or silvopasture, you have the option throughout that process of adapting the system or changing the system to adapt to the whatever the market might be at that time. For example, we could have decided after about the 13th year, right, what is the future? Is the future going to be for wood, for carbon? Is there going to be a lack of demand for sheep meat? And that could influence your decision. But because we had the system the way it is, we can make that decision. As it was, we thinned the trees, we took a quarter of them out, and we were able to sell that crop for about £800 a hectare. And then we've had one other subsequent thinning as well. So we're now down to under half of the original planting and still getting about 70% grazing. And we've had 2 injections of capital from the sale of the wood. I won't go into the agroforestry is a complex issue to predict economically, because you have you essentially have 2 components which are changing over time, their market value. And a lot of the novel research on the economics of that has been done in Wales at Bangor University, all of which have shown that silvopasture over conventional agriculture has a net positive gain. And there are different price scenarios depending on how the price of food or the price of timber would go, and that would influence by government support. Mauricio was talking about ecosystem services, if you like. In other words, what sort of things do we get from our farmland or get from nature? And if we think of our agroforestry system, we're not just getting meat and wool, but we're getting a whole range of other deliverables from a system like that. We're getting biodiversity, pollinators, renewable energy in terms of timber harvested. We're getting scenery in terms of a wide space trees, and the trees don't have to be planted in straight lines of the one species. That's an experimental trial where we were going down that route. And very, very importantly, we're getting carbon storage, we're getting a healthy soil, and we're getting water purification and flood prevention. And those increasingly with the climate change, the climate issues we're facing, are key deliverables that we want from the countryside. So in terms of we've proved the system could work, that economically it's viable, but in terms of environmental sustainability and its ability to deliver these ecosystem services, it offers us great potential, we feel. This map of Northern Ireland, the red areas, as you'd expect, are the problem areas, and you can see really we have a huge blob in the middle of the country, those are phosphate levels in soil, and they're all well above soil index 3, and that is a big problem. We have to try and get that soil index down. Similarly, at the bottom diagram is the ammonia emissions pattern for Northern Ireland, the same type of problem, the same type of areas because of high livestock production. Planting trees on that land, sometimes around cattle and poultry houses to absorb aerial deposition, but also to extract phosphate from the ground into the trees, are one biological solution that we can use to help at least deal with some of these problems. Over the lifetime of our agroforestry program, we've had considerable benefits through our link with Queen's University and also through EU projects we've had, which have enabled us to look at biodiversity benefits from the system. And this is just an example of after, I think it's maybe 8 or 9 years or so, where we were measuring spiders, birds, beetles, and all of those. The middle bar in that graph is all the agroforestry compared with the grassland on one side and the woodland on the other. And that extended into earthworms, and we've looked at other flora as well. All of them showed that agroforestry could bring biodiversity benefits to grassland systems. Gradually, as the trials progressed and we were getting into the 2000s, now carbon started to rear its head as the key issue. That there was a big demand to look at agricultural systems that could deliver improved carbon storage in soil, particularly in the context of grassland, and that's where agroforestry came in as an interest. So in I think it was 2013 or 14, we managed to get some funding to completely harvest. I think it was about 8 or 10 trees in our silvopasture system. It's not an easy job to try and get every root out of the ground and to weigh every single component and then get a carbon value for those. But what we showed was in that agroforestry system, the ash system that I showed you, we had the total carbon in the woody biomass above the ground was 77 tons per hectare. So that had accumulated over 20 years. So we were getting an accumulation rate of about 3 tons per hectare per year or over that, which was very encouraging indeed. And when we put that into overall figures for carbon sequestration, when we looked at that with mixed species, and we looked at that with in other sort of scenarios comparing with loss and with roots and so on, we've estimated that we are getting about 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year from the silvopasture. Then the ryegrass below that pasture is giving something in the order of a ton. So from our agroforestry, we're getting sequestration rates in the order of about 3 tons, 3.4 tons per hectare, which if you compare that with the citrus goose plantation is excellent because we're still getting those benefits of livestock production from the seam itself. Also, some of the work that AFBI's been doing, looking at the nature of that carbon stored in the soil, is that the carbon stored in the ash silvopasture is much more persistent or recalcitrant because it's bound to the tiny soil particles of carbon. Therefore, it's less likely to be lost in oxidation from the system. And then if you add, of course, the carbon that's in the trees as well, you've really got a very positive story in terms of soil carbon. The other huge benefit is really the ability to sustain grazing. We know that our grassland, we're not anything like maximum efficiency at grassland production and utilization, largely because we're a high rainfall area and animals can only be kept on pasture for a certain time in the year. If you look at the soil moisture content under silvopasture or agroforestry compared to grassland, and if you we map this by looking at soil moisture over the winter. We've done it over 2 winters. And if you look at the profile on the grassland plots, which is the top line, and the agroforestry at the bottom, you can see that obviously under agroforestry, the soil is drier because the trees and the tree root system have made it drier, and that has improved the carrying capacity. If you take as a cutoff, say, if we assume that a 40% soil moisture content is anything above that, really you're going to run into severe soil poaching problems. So animals should be taken off at that level. In over 2 years, in 1 year, the agroforestry gave us a 17-week longer season, and the other year it was about 14.5 weeks. So we could say, and if you take a minimum, we could get 3 months extra grazing under our silvopasture than we did under grassland. Now, if you use this at the right time of the year, if you integrate this into your grazing system, you can really improve the efficiency of production. You can also help to tackle your ammonia problem, because one of the problems with ammonia, of course, is that ammonia is given off when dung and urine meet. So in other words, whenever animals are housed, 96% of ammonia from animals is produced from slurry. So the longer you can keep animals at pasture, the more you can reduce the ammonia that's given off. We also looked at down through the profile, because we uniquely have these replicated trials, some of the longest running in Europe now, where we have reasonably good measurements kept over the years, and we now have an agroforest system that's almost 30 years old. We can look at the infiltration potential of the soil. In other words, the ability of the water to drain away from the soil itself. And this is a profile going down using a penetrator auger, going down through the soil. The agroforestry is the outer lines, and the grassland, the inner one. But basically, we found a significant difference in soil penetrability down to 76 centimeters in the soil. Now, that has huge potential for alleviation of flood control, for removing water absorption in the soil. Some of the big problems we're seeing in terms of runoff affecting our streams, rivers, and eventually our urban conurbations. And of course, as well as improving the soil carrying capacity for livestock. So we found these proven benefits from silvopasture. They can extend the grazing season, better grass utilization, more resilience to grazing during extreme rainfall, and the reduced ammonia emissions. We found increased biodiversity, increased carbon sequestration, reduced water runoff, can provide a renewable fuel, and it's got the potential to mine phosphate from greater volume of soil. But the question is, how can we introduce that into beef production systems, and how can we actually prove the benefits of those and get the message out there that agroforestry, not we're ever saying we will cover the whole country in agroforestry, but a small area of agroforestry integrated into each farm can have a significant difference on livestock production. On a recent TV climate change series in Southern Ireland on RTE on Science Week, one of the programs was looking at changes which would be required to fight climate change. And in that program, they focused an example between beef production from a low input multi-species sward integrated into a silvopastoral system in County Cavan in Ireland, and a high input intensive beef farm following all the latest government best practice advice. And on the organic farm, which was the low input unit, her profit per animal was exactly the same as the high output farm, which emitted twice the amount of carbon per hectare. Of course, she had to keep less animals, but still it showed that with that type of management, you could produce a very much more carbon efficient livestock system. There are, of course, many issues involved with that, and this was her farm. The breed selection, belted Galloways were a good cow for that scenario. The sward composition, she used mixed species swards with herbal lays, the presence of the trees, the winter carrying capacity, and the overall soil health. All of those were contributing to a more efficient system. So really, the ultimate dilemma really for grass-based ruminant agriculture is the recognition that farms can actually sequester greenhouse gases as well as emit them. If we look at any particular typical farm, we're aware of where the emissions are coming from our livestock, from our house livestock, and so on. Yet there's this sequestration is going on in the trees, in the hedgerows, in the woodlands, and in the soil itself on which those animals are grazing. So if we could incorporate these trees into livestock farms in a range of scenarios, for example, we know that hedgerows contain large quantities of stored carbon, and they sequester large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere. And we've shown that soil conditions, including levels of carbon, are directly influenced by the presence of a hedgerow as you move out. We have some data just from a PhD student we had in AFBI, and he's just completed his thesis, where he did a detailed survey of two hedges, a survey of two farms in Northern Ireland. One was an arable, mainly arable with grass farm, and the other was a livestock grazing farm, Loughgall, where some of the agroforestry work was. The arable farm, 69 hectares, the grass one. But if we go along, the key figures are there that he, through a lot of detailed work, he was able to measure the amount of carbon stored in hedges, which was 89 tonnes in one farm, 293 tonnes in another, and that was tonnes of carbon per hectare. Was much higher in the livestock farm than the arable one. Then he looked at the amount of carbon sequestered by the hedges, and that was a lowish figure, but it depended very much on the management of the hedgerow. Then he looked at the field margin 1 metre out from each side of the hedge, where you obviously would have a slightly different flora, and you would have plants that would have deeper rooting and would be storing more wood. And if you took that 1 metre each side of the hedge, and the hedge itself, that consisted of about 6% of the farm area, and the carbon stored, if you looked at that field boundary, there was 90 tonnes of carbon stored in that field boundary on the arable farm, and nearly 300 tonnes stored in the grassland farm. That was just the above ground part. He wasn't able to look at the root system of hawthorn hedges, but work in England by Axe et al. Has shown that you can get about 32 tonnes of carbon per hectare in the root system of hawthorn hedges. So if you think of our agroforestry scenario, where we were able to sequester about 3 tonnes of carbon per year, and if you think of looking at a livestock farming landscape, which would have hedges, trees, some silvopasture in the correct place, you can see that we can build up the argument that we've got a large stock of carbon there in the ground and in the soil, and we're sequestering that carbon at quite a considerable rate. You can then look at offsetting that against the emissions from the farm itself. We have a high-profile research site at Douth in the south of Ireland, which is funded by Devonish Nutrition, where they are trying to produce a carbon neutrality at a livestock stocking rate of 2 livestock units per hectare, and they're looking at exactly those things, using things like agroforestry, hedgerows, managing their hedgerows, improving the soil pH, reducing the ages of trees and hedges to encourage more vigorous growth, and incorporate agroforestry into their grazing platform. And they've calculated that if they do that, they could work towards a carbon neutral beef system. What are the barriers, to finish off really, what are the barriers to the uptake of the system? Well, first of all, I mean, I think, as has been hinted, there is an inherent resistance to forestry on this island, and probably in some scenarios in Wales there is as well. We have to really try and move away from seeing agroforestry in there. Again, we try to use the word silvopasture more, or farm woodland, or tree pasture or something, because forestry immediately conjures up an image of one or the other, grassland or forestry. We've got to try, and here there's probably some sociological work to do to try and get over this inherent resistance to the way that trees are put on the landscape. And so there's a lot of work to be done in there, but I think that the climate is right at the minute, to use a euphemism almost, because we really have to look at ways that we can make livestock farming more carbon neutral. Government has a part to play. There are 2 government support mechanisms on this island. In the south of Ireland, a very lucrative measure really for establishing agroforestry. These are both just for agroforestry, which is treated as a forestry measure in the south of Ireland, and in Northern Ireland it's a farming measure under the Rural Development Programme. There's a lot better support in the south, but it means your land goes out of the agriculture pool and into the forestry pool, which farmers don't like. In the north, it's only a 5-year support system, and it's being tested at the start. But both of them, there's a reasonable uptake. That there is a solid body of interest of farmers who are planting agroforestry under both these schemes. Both are imperfect, and it's very difficult to really provide a proper agriculture support measure under the conventional route. That's what that has taught us. It really requires some innovative thinking to come up with a novel support measure which is specifically tailored for agroforestry. So finally, how can we promote silvopasture on farms? Well, I think it has to be a two-pronged attack. Firstly, as a tree production system, I mean, there is, as I've said, a lot of us involved in agroforestry research have come from the agriculture side, from the grassland side. We have to recognize that there is also the potential to grow high-value trees in this system, and that could be of great value to the beleaguered farming and forestry industry. But secondly, we can promote silvopasture as a grassland system, which will produce nutritious, wholesome food, where farms can be made more sustainable and carbon friendly by incorporating trees at this range of levels. And we really need an organizational approach to act as a coordinated voice. Agroforestry is a very dispersed interest on this island. We need to try and get all those who are interested together to act with one voice. We need to educate people about agroforestry. We need to disseminate a lot of the research has been done. The evidence is out there. In a lot of cases, it's really trying to get that adopted into policy, and it's a completely unknown area for policymakers who admit that it's a hard one to get around because it encompasses so many different things, and it's really a new way to look at it. We need to train people who are interested in agroforestry, we need to promote it, and we need to lobby government. So in recent weeks, we've actually formed what we call an Agroforestry Forum, Irish Agroforestry Forum, to bring a group of people together who are involved in all these areas and to provide that level of advice. In fact, today is the first chance I've had to announce that we've actually got this formed. So the Irish Agroforestry Forum has been formed, and we believe that there is a role there for agroforestry to deliver a lot of these problems that hard-pressed livestock farmers are currently facing in Ireland. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you. That was truly very interesting. I'll read out some of the questions that have come in whilst you've been talking. The first one is in two halves. The first part of it is the difference between silviculture and agroforestry. Is it just the planting density of trees, or is there a bit more to it in terms of the terminology used? And also, if you were to look at how you could implement these systems, would you go with directly planting trees into the fields in rows or something similar, or would you go with a smaller, larger amount of smaller fields surrounded by thicker hedgerows, say, to get the trees in that way? So which of those two sort of approaches would make more sense?
Okay, well, the first part, silviculture is really the growing of trees. So silviculture, so trees. If you want to grow tall, straight trees, you have to plant them close together so they push each other up straight, and that's the way foresters think in terms of that's fine. That's the way to grow trees. In silvopasture or agroforest, if you like, you really are looking at a completely different idea. Your trees are planted into pasture or arable ground right from the start, and they're at wide spacing. Therefore, they would need attention to be pruned and so on if you're going to try and get a tall, straight, more efficient crop out of that. So the concept is different, but they're delivering different benefits at the end of the day. Another part of that pictures there show the trees in rows. Now, most farmers, when they go to plant agroforestry, they will plant trees in rows because they see, right, I won't have to drive a tractor up and down. I might want to make big bale silage. I might want to cut between that. But you don't have to approach it that way. You could contour plant round hills. You don't have to use the one species. In fact, mixtures of species are really ideal. And I don't see agroforestry ever as being a clear fail scenario. We're all familiar with the concept of growing conifers, fast conifers. They grow 40, 50 years and you cut them all down at once, and you start again with a pretty devastated landscape and away you go. In agroforestry, I see that would be a continuous cover type system. As you remove some trees, you might think of replanting into the spaces with different trees or with the same species. So you have got, if you like, a continuous cover of trees with a pasture beneath that. So it's continued to deliver those carbon benefits and biodiversity benefits that you want for. And I think that sort of answering a bit of the second question, which was about implementation of the system from that point of view.
Thank you very much. The next question is a little bit technical in nature. How much of an obstacle is the potential permanent loss of land due to the Forestry Act 1967?
We don't have, the Forestry Act doesn't apply in Ireland, so I can't directly answer that. But, well, this comes back to this point of how do you support tree planting. In our scenario, that top left, the top picture there, that is essentially treated by the government as agricultural land. So really, you could cut those trees down tomorrow and, you know, nobody would stop you. Whereas the bottom site, which is Jane Shackleton's site in Cavan, is in the south of Ireland. It's supported as a forestry measure where you can't cut those trees down. So a lot of it's to do with, your questioner is right. It's but because at the minute, you know, you don't want the complete flexibility of just wiping out the system of somebody who's bound by the shackle and running the risk of losing your basic payment and so on. But we don't have the 65 Forestry Act here.
Thank you very much. Lastly, out of the questions, just to, I mean, there's obviously some challenges with implementing from a point of view of government legislation and you know, myriad others. Actually working with the livestock and trees, I wonder over the sort of the 30 years of experience you had, what challenges you encountered actually getting the sheep or the cattle to integrate with the trees, whether there were issues with compaction stopping tree growth, or whether you suffered terribly with other effects that I can't even begin to imagine that the livestock might have encountered. What was your experience?
Well, very, very good question, because right from the start of the programme, we concentrated on livestock performance and production. For example, we measured meat production, the type of meat, the quality of meat. We looked at wool production, and we looked at all aspects of livestock performance. We found that, first of all, our systems were established under sheep, and the sheep interacted with the trees quite positively. In other words, and that was obviously climate related as well. On hot sunny days, the sheep would be under the trees. On wet days, they'd be under the trees. In our initial trials, and that experiment I described across the UK, we compared a very low density of tree establishment, that was 100 trees per hectare, that's trees 10 metres apart, with the 400 trees per hectare, trees 5 metres apart. And on every site, this is one very significant result, the trees at 100 metres, plant 100 metres per hectare, did not establish well. And we did a lot of measurements on that, and we proved that to be soil compaction around the trees. Just the number of sheep per tree was just too high, and because of the fact that the sheep did go around the trees, that led to just simply too much pressure on those trees. So that's why we've sort of fixed, looking at the range of trials there have been, we have opted for a planting density of about 400 trees per hectare. That seems to give the trees the best chance, and we really found no negative effects but on the sheep themselves. There are problems with sheep nibbling the bark and grazing the bark of trees, and you've got to protect them. Cattle don't nibble them, but they do rub against them, so therefore introducing and protecting cattle into agroforestry is difficult until the trees are 5 or 6, 7 years old. But we found no negative effects on animal performance. Indeed, we concluded that because we were able to get this 12 or 13, the output of animal production we were getting was above what we would have expected from the pasture alone, that the trees were actually getting a physiological benefit from the shelter and shade, that the sheep were getting this benefit from the shelter and shade that the trees were bringing.
Thank you very much. Professor Jim McAdam, on behalf of the audience, I'd like to say thanks ever so much for sharing your experience and insights with us. It's been a genuinely fascinating talk. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I'll pass back over to my colleague Hazel, who's I think going to just summarise this evening for us quickly. Yes, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks. Also, we've come to the end of the evening. I would just like to thank the panel for giving their time this evening, for their very excellent and very valuable contributions. Already had some positive feedback, so I'm really grateful for your insight. Thanks also to those of you who joined us this evening and those who've been in touch with questions. Apologies if our time allocation didn't allow us to go through them all, but I still hope that you found the evening informative and interesting. And with that, I'll now bring the meeting to a close. So thank you, stay safe, and have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.